Arthur. And that is exactly what they want you to believe, that the early church was completely unified, that the apostles handed down a single, pristine message, and everyone from Jerusalem to Rome just looked at it and agreed. Thomas, because they did agree. We have the texts to prove it. We have the New Testament. It survived 2,000 years of history because it was the objective truth. Arthur, it didn't survive because it was the truth. It survived because the Roman Empire made it a capital offense to read anything else. Thomas, a capital offense? That sounds like a massive exaggeration. We are talking about bishops and monks in the early church, not a military dictatorship. They argued over theology, sure. They wrote angry letters, but they didn't execute people for reading the wrong gospel. Howard, I wish you were right. I really do, because for 22 years, I stood up in my church, Sunday after Sunday, and recited the Nicene Creed. I said those words without once asking where they came from, or whose blood was spilled to make sure those were the only words left for me to say. Arthur, they wrote words you recited, and they burned the men who tried to recite anything else. Thomas, burned? Are you talking about the Middle Ages? The Spanish Inquisition? That happened centuries later. Arthur, I am talking about the 4th century, between 300 AD and 400 AD, the 100 years that completely erased the actual origins of Christianity, and it was engineered by the state. Howard, we were taught that the early church was a pure, spiritual community that only formalized its doctrines to protect itself from false teachings. But that is not what the historical record shows. The record shows a state-enforced purge. Thomas, a purge? By who? The Vatican didn't even exist in the 4th century, in the way we think of it today. You are applying a modern concept to ancient history. Arthur, the administrative institution known today as the Vatican may have evolved later, but the Roman Imperial Church under Emperors Constantine and Theodosius held the exact same institutional lineage. They were the state-sponsored bishops, and they didn't just excommunicate people, they weaponized the law. Howard, what if everything you were taught about the purity of the early church was a complete lie, not created by God, but created by Roman emperors and power-hungry bishops? What if the books that didn't fit the imperial agenda were burned under penalty of death? How can you ever know what Jesus or the original disciples actually taught? Thomas, if that were true, there would be legal records. Decrees. You can't just erase entire Christian movements without leaving a paper trail. The Romans documented everything. Arthur, oh, there is a paper trail, and it is terrifying. And we are going to look at exactly what happened. Howard, to understand the scale of what happened, we need to dig into the actual historical context. We need to look at what the Roman Empire looked like in the early 4th century. It was an empire in crisis. It was fracturing under its own weight. And to understand what happened to the church, you have to understand what Constantine was trying to achieve. Arthur, Constantine wasn't a theologian. He was a military commander. He saw a fractured empire, and he needed a unifying force. And he looked at Christianity, which was spreading rapidly, and saw a tool for political cohesion. Thomas, but he converted, didn't he? He had a vision at the Milvian Bridge. He saw the sign of the cross and conquered in that name. Arthur, that is the mythos that was written later. The reality is that Constantine continued to patronize pagan cults for years after his supposed conversion. He retained the title of Pontifex Maximus, the head of the pagan state religion. His interest in Christianity was intensely pragmatic. Howard, and that pragmatism is what drove the Council of Nicaea. He didn't convene the council because he was deeply concerned about the eternal soul of the empire. He convened it because theological disputes in Alexandria were causing riots, and riots disrupt tax collection and imperial stability. Thomas. So the foundational doctrine of the Christian faith, the Nicene Creed, was drafted to stop riots over tax collection? Arthur. It was drafted to enforce political unity, and once that unity was established on paper, the state had to enforce it in reality. Which brings us back to the Theodosian Code. Howard. To understand the scale of what happened, you have to realize how diverse early Christianity actually was. For the first 300 years, there wasn't just one version of Jesus. There were dozens of Christianities. Thomas. But they were fringe groups, right? Heretics that nobody took seriously. Arthur. No, that is the narrative written by the winners. Bart Ehrman, the historian at the University of North Carolina, makes this incredibly clear in his work on lost Christianities. These weren't small cults. They were massive, thriving communities. They had their own gospels, their own traditions, their own bishops. Thomas. If they were so massive, why didn't they survive? Why did only one version of Christianity make it through to the modern world? Howard. Because of power. The communities Ehrman describes didn't just fade away because their arguments were weak. They were deliberately, systematically dismantled. The Marcionites, the Ebionites, the Gnostics, they represented entirely different ways of understanding the divine. And for a while, they coexisted. Arthur. They coexisted until coexistence became politically inconvenient. In 325 AD, the Emperor Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea, not out of deep spiritual devotion, but because he needed a unified religion to hold a fractured Roman Empire together. Thomas. Wait. You are saying the Council of Nicaea was a political strategy, not a theological awakening? Arthur. He needed one empire, one emperor, and one God. You can't have a unified political structure if your population is divided over the nature of the divine. Constantine didn't care about the theological nuances of the Trinity. He cared about imperial stability. Thomas. Okay, but the Council of Nicaea just voted on orthodoxy. They selected the texts that had the most apostolic authority. That is religious discernment, not political censorship. It was a theological debate. Arthur. It started as a theological debate, but it ended as criminal law. Let me read you something. This is from the Theodosian Code, Book 15th. These are the imperial decrees starting in 380 AD, specifically the Edict of Thessalonica. Thomas. The Roman Law Code? You're citing a secular legal document to explain church history? Arthur. Exactly. Because church history and state law became the exact same thing. The Emperor Theodosius made Nicene Christianity the sole legal state religion. And he didn't just say, "This is our official stance." He outlawed every other interpretation. Howard. The decree literally branded anyone who didn't follow the Nicene Creed as demented and insane. It explicitly ordered the confiscation of their property, the destruction of their churches, and the burning of their texts. Thomas. Wait. You are telling me the Roman government made it a crime to hold a different theological view? Arthur. Yes. If you possessed a text that contradicted the official state doctrine, an Arian text, a Gnostic text, anything outside the approved list, you weren't just a heretic. You were a criminal of the state. Thomas, but surely they didn't actually enforce that. It was probably just political posturing. Ancient laws were always dramatic, but local magistrates rarely carried them out against their own neighbors. Howard. That's what I thought too. When I was a deacon, I assumed the church grew through preaching and conviction. But then I read Catherine Nixie's documentation in The Darkening Age. It wasn't posturing. It was a systematic, brutal campaign of textual erasure. Arthur. They sent imperial soldiers into towns. They ransacked private homes. They confiscated entire libraries and burned them in public squares. They didn't just burn pagan texts, they targeted heterodox Christian writings with absolute precision. Thomas, why? I need to see the evidence for this. A single law code doesn't prove widespread destruction. Where is the proof that they actually burned these specific Christian books? Howard, the proof isn't just in what was burned. The proof is in what was hidden. Howard, I want to pause here and really dig into what was lost, because when we say other Christianities, it's easy to just write them off as strange, fringe cults. But what were they actually teaching? Arthur, let's look at the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, which was one of the texts discovered and studied after being hidden for centuries. In that text, Mary is portrayed as one of the closest disciples of Jesus, someone who understood his teachings on a deeper spiritual level than Peter did. Thomas, Peter? The rock of the church? Arthur? Exactly. The text explicitly shows a conflict between Peter and Mary. Peter represents the orthodox, institutional, male-dominated hierarchy that was beginning to form. Mary represents the inner, visionary, egalitarian spiritual experience. Howard. And guess which version of Christianity the Roman Empire decided was the truth? They chose the version that consolidated power in the hands of bishops, men like Peter. They systematically erased the version that said anyone could have a direct, unmediated experience of the divine, like Mary. Thomas, because an unmediated experience of the divine can't be taxed, it can't be controlled, it can't be organized into a state religion. Arthur? Exactly. The suppression of the Gospel of Mary wasn't just a theological disagreement, it was a political necessity. If Mary's version of Christianity had survived, the entire hierarchical structure of the Roman imperial church would have been completely undermined. Howard. And it wasn't just Mary. Look at the Gospel of Philip. Look at the secret book of John. These texts emphasized a spiritual journey of self-discovery, of finding the light of God within the human soul. They didn't focus on original sin, or blood atonement, or the absolute authority of the bishop. Thomas. So they were offering a Christianity that was fundamentally liberating rather than controlling. Arthur? Yes. And a liberating religion is useless to an emperor trying to control a fracturing empire. Constantine needed a religion of obedience, not a religion of liberation. Howard. This is why the decrees in the Theodosian Code were so brutal. They weren't just fighting a theological error, they were fighting an existential threat to the political order. The heterodox Christians were a threat because they refused to submit to the ideological monopoly of the state. Thomas. It's staggering. It completely flips the narrative. The heretics weren't the ones trying to destroy the church. They were the ones trying to preserve the original liberating message of Jesus from being co-opted by the Roman Empire. Arthur. And for their efforts, they were branded as demented. Their property was confiscated, their books were burned, and in cases like Priscillian, their heads were cut off. Howard. Let's look at another group that was completely erased, the Ebionites. Arthur. The Ebionites were Jewish Christians. They believed that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah, but they completely rejected the virgin birth, and they rejected the Apostle Paul. They believed Paul was an apostate who had corrupted the true message. Thomas. They rejected Paul? But Paul wrote half the New Testament. Howard. Exactly. The Ebionites believed that to follow Jesus, you had to follow the Jewish law. They were strict monotheists, and for a long time, they were a significant force in the early Christian world. Arthur? But as the church became increasingly Gentile and increasingly aligned with Roman power, the Ebionites became an embarrassment. They were too Jewish for the Roman taste. So their texts were suppressed, their leaders were condemned, and their entire community was systematically marginalized until they disappeared from history. Thomas. It's incredible. They were the closest theological descendants of the original disciples in Jerusalem, and they were branded as heretics by a church based in Rome. Howard. And then you have the Marcionites. Marcion was a wealthy shipowner from the Black Sea region who came to Rome in the 2nd century. He believed that the God of the Old Testament, the God of wrath and law, was a completely different entity from the God of love revealed by Jesus. Arthur Marcion actually created the very first Christian canon. He gathered the Gospel of Luke and 10 of Paul's letters, and he rejected everything else, including the entire Old Testament. He had a massive following. His churches rivaled the Orthodox churches in size and influence. Thomas: I've never even heard of him. If his movement was that massive, why did it vanish? Howard: It vanished because the Proto-Orthodox Church realized that Marcion's theology was a massive threat. If you disconnect Christianity from its historical roots in Judaism, you lose the historical legitimacy that the Roman mind craved. So the Proto-Orthodox leaders counterattacked. They didn't just argue with Marcion, they launched a massive campaign to delegitimize his movement. Arthur: And once the Proto-Orthodox faction aligned with the Roman state in the 4th century, the Marcionites were targeted just like the Gnostics and the Arians. Their churches were closed, their texts were burned, and their theology was erased from the public square. Thomas: So the early church wasn't a single stream that flowed smoothly from Jesus to the present day. It was a battlefield. Howard: It was a battlefield where the winners wrote the history and burned the books of the losers, and the winners were the ones who had the backing of the Roman emperor. Arthur: Let's jump to the year 367 AD. But before we do, we need to understand the cultural shift that happened between Constantine and Athanasius. In just a few decades, Christianity went from a persecuted minority to the absolute dominant power in the Roman state. And when the oppressed become the oppressors, they often use the exact same tools that were used against them. Thomas: You mean the Christians started persecuting the pagans? Howard: They didn't just persecute the pagans, they persecuted other Christians. The definition of Christian became incredibly narrow, and anyone who fell outside that narrow definition was treated as an enemy of the state. The tolerance that early Christians had begged for was entirely abandoned once they had the power of the imperial sword. Arthur: Which brings us to Athanasius. Let's jump to the year 367 AD. A man named Athanasius is the Bishop of Alexandria. He is one of the most powerful figures in the church. Howard Athanasius is the one who finally drew up the exact list of the 27 books that make up the New Testament we have today. The very first time that specific list appears in history is in his 39th Festal Letter. Thomas: Right. And he sent that list out to unify the churches. What is wrong with that? We needed a canon. We needed to know which books were reliable. Arthur: He didn't just send a list of what to read, he sent an order of what to destroy. He commanded monks across Egypt to purge their monasteries of any book not on his approved list. Thomas: Purge them how? You mean stop reading them in church? Arthur: I mean throwing them into the fire? Athanasius declared that the springs of salvation were only in his approved texts, and everything else was a poison that had to be eradicated. He told his followers to physically destroy the books of their rivals. Howard: Think about what it means to be a monk in a desert monastery in the 4th century. Your entire life is devoted to God. You have spent years meticulously hand-copying sacred texts on papyrus, texts that your community has used for generations for spiritual guidance. Arthur: And suddenly, a letter arrives from the bishop in Alexandria, backed by the threat of imperial violence, telling you that the books you pray with are demonic, and you must burn them. Thomas: I understand that's harsh, but if the books were spiritually dangerous, if they were teaching things that led people away from God. Howard: Who gets to decide they are dangerous? The men with the swords? The emperor sitting in his palace? Are we really comfortable saying that the definition of divine truth was settled by the guy with the biggest army? Arthur, Elaine Pagels, the historian from Princeton, documented exactly how these communities reacted, because they didn't just blindly obey. In December of 1945, a local farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman was digging for fertilizer near the town of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt. Thomas, what did he find? Something that proves the burnings happened? Howard, he found a massive, sealed earthenware jar buried deep in the desert sand. Inside that jar were 13 leather-bound papyrus codices containing over 50 ancient Christian texts. Arthur, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Secret Book of John, texts that the Western world had not seen for over 1,500 years. Thomas, why were they buried in a jar? Were they a time capsule? Howard, because they were buried in the exact same period, around 367 AD, that Bishop Athanasius issued his order to burn them. They weren't a time capsule. They were a rescue mission. Arthur, the monks at the Pachomian monastery near Nag Hammadi couldn't bring themselves to burn their own sacred scriptures, but they knew if the imperial authorities found the books, they would be punished. So they sealed them in jars and carried them out into the desert. They chose the desert over the fire. Thomas, okay, that is disturbing. The fact that they had to hide them implies they were terrified. But maybe they were just a small group of rebels who wouldn't let go of their specific tradition. Arthur, hiding implies danger. Danger implies enforcement. These weren't fringe texts that nobody cared about. They were deeply loved, actively used spiritual documents. The only reason they are fringe today is because the Roman Empire successfully burned the rest of them. Thomas, but what was in them? Why were they considered so dangerous that a bishop would demand they be burned? Howard, because they offered a direct connection to the divine. The Gospel of Thomas, for example, doesn't have a narrative of Jesus dying for our sins. It doesn't establish a church hierarchy. It's just a collection of sayings, and the central message is that the kingdom of God is already inside you. Arthur, exactly. And if the kingdom of God is inside you, you don't need a bishop. You don't need an emperor. You don't need the institution to mediate your relationship with God. And to a Roman emperor trying to build a unified power structure, that is the most dangerous idea in the world. Thomas, I feel sick just thinking about that. The idea that monks were running into the desert at night to save the words of Jesus from other Christians, it completely shatters the illusion of unity. Howard, it does. It ruins the whole narrative. Growing up in the church, they made it sound like God handed down the 66 books directly from heaven. No one ever told us that the canon was curated by men who were threatening to burn their brothers alive. Thomas, but did they actually kill anyone? You mentioned the death penalty earlier. Confiscating books is one thing. Burning texts is terrible. But they didn't actually execute other Christians over theology, did they? Arthur, they did. And this is where the story goes from censorship to murder. Howard, the year is 385 AD, and the machinery of the state has now been fully integrated with the machinery of the church. The bishops are no longer just spiritual leaders, they are political operatives. They have the ear of the emperor, and they use that access to settle theological scores. Arthur, this is the darkest shift in the history of the institution. The church transitions from a community of faith to a department of the Roman government. And with that transition comes the power of life and death. Thomas, it's hard to reconcile the teachings of Jesus with the actions of a state-sponsored executioner. Howard, It is impossible to reconcile. And that is why this history has been so carefully sanitized. Because if you look too closely at the 4th century, the illusion of a pure, unbroken apostolic succession completely falls apart. The year is 385 AD, 18 years after Athanasius ordered the books burned. The imperial machinery of orthodoxy has only grown stronger. Arthur. A man named Priscillian of Avila is a highly respected ascetic and a bishop in Spain. He is wealthy, he is educated, and he leads a massive movement of Christians who practice strict fasting and deep spiritual contemplation. Thomas. So he is a devout Christian leader. He's not a pagan. He's an insider. Howard. Yes, he's a bishop. But Priscillian and his followers read texts that the state church didn't like. They read apocryphal writings. They emphasized personal spiritual experience over the rigid authority of the institutional bishops. Arthur. And the institutional bishops could not stand that. They couldn't control him. His popularity was a threat to the established order. So they didn't just argue with him in a council. They didn't just write letters condemning his theology. They brought him up on charges before the Roman Emperor Maximus. Thomas. Charges of what? Heresy? You can't put a man on trial before a secular emperor for reading a different book. Arthur. Yes, you can. Under the very imperial laws we talked about earlier. Priscillian was put on trial by the secular Roman state at the formal, explicit request of Christian bishops. They weaponized the state apparatus to eliminate a theological rival. Howard. They tortured him. They tortured a Christian bishop to extract a confession of sorcery and immorality. And then Emperor Maximus ordered him to be executed. Arthur Priscillian of Avila was beheaded with a sword in 385 AD, along with several of his followers, including a prominent woman named Eucrotia. Thomas. They cut his head off. Howard. Yes, Thomas. For reading the wrong books. Arthur. For reading the wrong books and for refusing to bow to the theological monopoly of the Roman state. It is the first documented execution for heresy in the history of Christianity. And the executioners weren't pagans throwing Christians to the lions. They were the Christian state, killing its own. Thomas. How did the rest of the church react to this? Surely there was outrage. You can't just behead a bishop and expect everyone to be fine with it. Howard. There was outrage. Some prominent figures like Martin of Tours were absolutely horrified. They protested. They said it was a dark day for the faith when secular swords were used to settle spiritual matters. Arthur. But the outrage didn't stop the machinery. The precedent was set. From that moment on, orthodoxy was tied to violence. If you crossed the doctrinal line, you weren't just risking your soul. You were risking your life. Howard. I spent my whole life feeling guilty for asking hard questions. I thought my doubts were a sin. Whenever I couldn't make sense of a doctrine, I blamed myself. It never once crossed my mind that the early church literally executed people for asking those same questions. Thomas, I don't know what to do with this information. It recontextualizes everything I've ever believed. Arthur. Look at the pattern. This isn't just about Christianity. This is the grammar of empire. 600 years earlier, in 213 BC, Emperor Qin Shi Huang outlawed competing philosophical schools in China and burned their books to enforce state orthodoxy. Around 650 AD, within a generation of these events, Caliph Uthman burned all variant manuscripts of the Quran to enforce a single imperial text. Howard. The mechanism is always the exact same. State religion, banned books, and a criminal penalty for possession. The Christian textual purge wasn't divine providence. It was the universal grammar of institutional power. Thomas. Earlier, in the beginning of this conversation, I said that the New Testament survived because it was the truth. Arthur. I remember. You said it survived because everyone agreed on it, because the Holy Spirit guided the process. Thomas. I was wrong. I was completely wrong. It didn't survive because it was the only truth. It survived because the people who held it had the power of the Roman army behind them. And the people who held the other texts had to bury them in the dirt just to keep them safe. Howard, that realization changes everything, doesn't it? Thomas, it makes me feel like my entire worldview was built on a curated canon created by Roman politics, not divine truth. I feel like I've been betrayed, like my faith was enforced by the sword rather than revealed by God. I don't know how to unsee this. I can never unsee this. Arthur? And that brings us to the most uncomfortable question of all. We've talked about the book burnings. We've talked about the execution of Priscillian. We've talked about the monks hiding their sacred texts in the desert. But what does this mean for the average person sitting in a pew today? Thomas, it means that the Bible they are holding, the doctrines they are reciting, the history they have been taught, is a carefully curated product of Roman political strategy. It means the foundation is cracked. Howard, it means that the spiritual authority they have trusted their entire lives was established through violence and censorship. And once you see the blood on the foundation, you can never look at the building the same way again. Arthur. And that brings us to the most uncomfortable question of all. If the foundation of the institutional church was built on the violent suppression of competing ideas, what does that mean for the structure today? Thomas. It means the structure is compromised. It means every time they tell you not to question a doctrine, they are just repeating the logic of the 4th century. They are just using excommunication instead of execution because they don't have the political power to execute people anymore. Howard, that's exactly the realization that broke my faith, or at least the version of faith I was handed. When I finally read the historical documents, when I saw the actual edicts from the Theodosian Code, I realized that the unity I had been preaching for 22 years was an artificial construct. Arthur? It was a manufactured consensus. Catherine Nixie points this out brilliantly. The destruction wasn't just limited to Christian texts. The campaign of erasure extended to the classical world. They destroyed libraries. They smashed statues. They dismantled centuries of philosophical inquiry because it threatened the absolute monopoly of the new state religion. Thomas. They didn't just want to control Christianity. They wanted to control reality itself. They wanted to erase any alternative way of understanding the universe. Howard. Yes, and for a long time they succeeded. The Dark Ages weren't just a loss of technology, they were a loss of intellectual diversity. The enforced orthodoxy created an intellectual bottleneck that lasted for over 1,000 years. Arthur. Until people started finding the buried jars. Until the texts at Nag Hammadi were unearthed. Until the documents started coming to light. The earth itself literally spit back the truth that the empire tried to burn. Thomas. But how do we live with this? How do you go back to a normal life after you realize that the most sacred institutions in your culture are built on a foundation of intellectual genocide? Howard. You don't go back. You move forward. You realize that the divine, if it exists, cannot be contained in a curated list of approved books enforced by a Roman emperor. You realize that asking questions isn't a sin. It's the only way to actually honor the truth. Arthur. The truth doesn't need a sword to defend it. Only a lie requires a law to make people believe it. Thomas. Only a lie requires a law to make people believe it. I need to write that down. That completely reframes how I look at religious authority. Howard. It reframed everything for me too. And it's a terrifying process. The deconstruction of your worldview is not a gentle experience. It feels like you are losing the ground beneath your feet. Because you are. The ground was artificial. Arthur. But once you strip away the imperial decrees, once you strip away the violence and the censorship, what you are left with is the actual historical reality. It's messier. It's more complex, but it is real. Thomas, I'd rather have a messy, complicated truth than a pristine, manufactured lie, even if the truth is uncomfortable. Howard, that is exactly where this journey leads, to a place where you are no longer afraid of the history, where you don't have to defend the indefensible actions of 4th century bishops just to feel spiritually secure. Howard, you can't unsee it. And honestly, you shouldn't. The discomfort you are feeling right now is exactly what it feels like to wake up. Arthur, the history is brutal, but it is the history. The texts at Nag Hammadi aren't just artifacts in a museum. They are a monument to the people who refused to let their spiritual lives be dictated by imperial decrees. They are the voices of the persecuted, speaking to us across 15 centuries. Thomas, I came into this conversation thinking I knew how the church was formed. I thought I was defending the legacy of the apostles, but I was actually just defending the legacy of Emperor Theodosius. I was defending the legacy of the people who cut off Priscillian's head. Howard, we all were. When I stood in my church as a deacon, reciting the Nicene Creed, I believed I was speaking the eternal, unbroken truth of God. I didn't know I was speaking the legal doctrine of a Roman emperor who threatened to confiscate the property of anyone who disagreed. I was speaking the words of the victors, completely blind to the victims. Arthur, but now you know. The orthodoxy we inherited wasn't a victory of theological truth. It was a victory of state violence. The reason we have the Bible in its current form isn't a miracle of consensus. It's a miracle of survival. Thomas, the books didn't win because they were the only words of God. They won because the men who read them burned the men who didn't. Howard, exactly. The canon wasn't formed by divine consensus. It was formed by the sword. That is the truth they tried to burn. But the desert remembered what the empire tried to erase. Howard, if you've been watching this and feeling that same sense of betrayal, I want you to know you aren't alone. In the pinned comment below, I've linked the Spinoza Forever Library. It's 5 volumes of research, including the historical documents, the imperial edicts, and the sources we talked about today. You don't have to take my word for it. You can read the history yourself. Howard, before we go, if this conversation helped you piece together a history you were never taught, leaving a like and subscribing tells the algorithm that this kind of honest, difficult historical debate matters. Because there is a lot more history they didn't teach us in Sunday school, and we have many more layers to peel back. Howard, I want to hear from you. Write the word desert in the comments if that moment at Nag Hammadi made you completely rethink how the Bible was put together. The conversation continues down there. Take care of yourselves.